1922, something unusual happened on the international stage. The world's most powerful nations, America, Britain, Japan, France, and Italy, sat down together and agreed to limit the size of their navies. They signed a treaty called the Washington Naval Treaty, and on paper, it looked like a landmark moment of international cooperation. Countries were voluntarily shrinking their fleets. The world seemed to be choosing peace over military competition. But here is what most people do not know. Behind that treaty, behind the handshakes and the diplomatic language, a very different story was playing out. America was quietly laying the groundwork for something that would eventually become the most powerful naval force the world had ever seen. Not through open competition, not through public announcements, but through decades of careful planning, secret technology development, strategic deception, and one of the most remarkable industrial buildups in the history of warfare. Today, I want to take you inside that story. How America went from a nation that had willingly limited its own navy to the undisputed master of every ocean on Earth, and how much of that transformation happened in ways that the rest of the world did not fully see coming. Let me start with the Washington Naval Treaty of 1922, because understanding what it actually said and what it did not say is the key to understanding everything that came after. The treaty set strict limits on how many large warships, called capital ships, each country could have. It also set limits on the total tonnage of those ships. America, Britain, and Japan agreed to a ratio. For every 5 tons of American and British warships, Japan could have 3 tons. France and Italy got slightly smaller allocations. On the surface, America appeared to be accepting a constraint. We were agreeing not to build a navy larger than a certain size. But look at what the treaty actually did for America. It codified American naval equality with Britain, the country that had ruled the seas for over a century. It permanently capped Japan's fleet below America's in official terms. And crucially, the treaty said almost nothing about submarines or the technology that would actually define naval warfare in the coming decades. American naval strategists were not naive about this. They understood that the treaty limited the kind of ships that had dominated the last war, not necessarily the ships and technologies that would dominate the next one. While publicly agreeing to limit battleships, American planners quietly began investing in the technologies and concepts that the treaty did not restrict. The limitations of the treaty, in a very real sense, helped focus American innovation exactly where it needed to go. Here is where the story gets really fascinating. The Washington Naval Treaty forced both America and Japan to convert some of their partially built battleships into aircraft carriers instead to comply with the tonnage limits. This felt at the time like a compromise, a second-best solution forced on both navies by the treaty's restrictions. But it turned out to be one of the most fortunate accidents in American naval history. The ships converted under this arrangement became America's first large fleet carriers, the USS Lexington and the USS Saratoga. And the experience of operating and developing these ships, of learning how to launch and recover aircraft from a moving deck at sea, of figuring out how to coordinate carrier air groups with surface ships and submarines, gave the United States Navy a head start in carrier warfare that would prove absolutely decisive in the Pacific just 2 decades later. While Japan was also developing carriers, and doing so with impressive skill and seriousness, American naval aviation was quietly evolving into something that would redefine what sea power meant. The old idea was that the biggest battleship with the most guns won naval battles. The new idea, which American planners were developing, testing, and refining through the 1920s and 1930s, was that the navy that could project air power the farthest and fastest would control the ocean. By the time that idea was fully tested in battle, America was already much further along in understanding it than most of the world realized. For most of the 1920s and early 1930s, America actually did not build up to even the limits the treaty allowed. Congress was reluctant to fund military spending during the Great Depression, and public opinion was strongly against anything that looked like preparation for another war. The American Navy was, for a period, genuinely smaller and less ready than its treaty limits permitted. But in 1940, everything changed. Germany had conquered France in just 6 weeks. Britain was fighting for survival. Japan was expanding aggressively across Asia and the Pacific. President Roosevelt and his military advisors looked at the world map and saw something alarming. America could potentially face 2 major naval powers, Japan in the Pacific and Germany in the Atlantic at the same time. The existing navy was not large enough to fight both at once and win. In July 1940, Congress passed the Two-Ocean Navy Act, the largest naval expansion bill in American history up to that point. It authorized the construction of a navy 70% larger than what America already had. New battleships, new carriers, new cruisers, new destroyers, new submarines. All of it approved in a single piece of legislation. The price tag was approximately $4 billion, which in today's money is roughly $80 billion. And American shipyards immediately began the most ambitious naval construction program any country had ever attempted. When Japan attacked Pearl Harbor in December 1941, their military planners had a theory about what the attack would accomplish. The theory was this: by destroying the American battleship fleet in Hawaii, Japan would buy itself enough time to consolidate its territorial gains across the Pacific before America could rebuild and counterattack. Japanese planners estimated they had roughly 18 months to 2 years before America's industrial capacity could produce enough warships to threaten Japan's new Pacific Empire. That estimate was wrong by a margin that proved catastrophic for Japan. What Japanese planners had not fully accounted for was the scale and speed at which American industry could operate when it was fully committed to a goal. The Two-Ocean Navy Act had been passed 17 months before Pearl Harbor. American shipyards had already been expanding and gearing up for over a year. Workers had been hired. Steel had been ordered. Dry docks had been built and expanded. The industrial machine was already moving when December 7th, 1941, hit the accelerator. And critically, the attack on Pearl Harbor sank battleships, ships that were already becoming less strategically important in the new era of carrier warfare. The American aircraft carriers were not in Pearl Harbor that day. They were at sea. The ships that would actually win the Pacific War were untouched. Japan had delivered a devastating blow to yesterday's Navy, while the Navy of tomorrow was already being built in shipyards all across America, largely out of sight and out of Japan's ability to calculate or disrupt. During the war years, America built 27 fleet aircraft carriers, 111 escort carriers, 8 battleships, 48 cruisers, 349 destroyers, and 203 submarines. By the end of the war in 1945, the United States Navy was larger than every other navy in the world combined. Not just larger than Japan, not just larger than Germany, larger than all of them put together. That is an almost impossible thing to comprehend, and it happened in roughly 4 years. American ships built during this period incorporated radar systems, fire control computers, and weapons technology that in many areas surpassed what any other navy was deploying. The quantity was stunning. But the technology inside each ship was just as important as how many ships were being built. America was not just winning the shipbuilding race, it was advancing the technology of naval warfare faster than anyone else at the same time.